Welcome back to day 4 and also the final day of the Ogden Sewalong. Today we're going to start by understitching, and what understitching is, it's a stitching that we use to help keep the facing to the inside of the garment, and it's made by pressing the seam allowances towards the facing and then stitching close to the edge of the seam on the facing side, catching that seam allowance underneath. And it just really helps that facing stay to the inside of the garment and not pull out. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to gently pull the facing away from the main garment, and with the seam allowances pressed towards the facing, we're going to go ahead and press that all the way around where we can. Now, you won't be able to do that all the way up into the strap area because those corners are too tight, but at the underarm and along the front and the back, you're going to be able to press that seam allowance and facing away from the main garment. Admit that this can sometimes feel a little bit awkward and not intuitive, but just go slow and I promise it'll work out just fine. And now that we have that all pressed, we're going to go over to our sewing machine, and then we're going to stitch very close to that seam line, but on the facing side. And we're going to do that once again in just the areas that we can. So it'll be a couple inches inside of each strap, but along the underarm seam, and then once again along the front and the back. And just be sure that this whole time you are catching the seam allowance underneath in your stitching to the facing. That is what helps it keep it to the inside and keep the lining from popping out. Okay, this is what it should look like when you're done. Can you see that little line of stitching right there on the inside? It's really close to that seam edge. And now that that's done, we can go ahead and give the top area, the neckline, the armholes, all a final press. The lining should be slightly cheated towards the inside of your cami. Use lots of steam, steam is your friend, and just make it look nice and crisp. Now we're going to hem the bottom of our Ogden cami. You may want to try on your Ogden first just to check the length of the hem, but once you're happy with that, we are going to fold up the bottom edge by 1/4 of an inch, just like we did for the lining. Once again, I am someone who does this by sight, but you can be much more precise than I am if you like. So fold the bottom edge up by 1/4 of an inch and then fold it on itself again by another 1/4 of an inch all the way around. Now you might want to pin your hem up at this point. Once again, my fabric presses really well, so I didn't feel like I needed to. Now I'm going to go over to my sewing machine and back stitching at both ends. I'm going to stitch just along that inside folded edge, or about a scant 1/4 of an inch in from the bottom folded edge. It should look something like this. You might want to give it a nice final press, and that is it for your hem. So the last thing that we're going to do is we are going to tack the lining in at the side seams just to give it a little bit more help staying tucked to the inside. So what I do is I line up my lining with my side seams of my main cami really well, and I pin it in place. And then you just want to secure that in place. So you can use a hand sewing needle and you can just tack the bottom of the lining to the seam allowance on the inside, or you can use your regular sewing machine and you can stitch in the ditch just for about 1/4 of an inch right there on the right side of your cami, and that's usually what I do. that is it. Our Ogden cami is done. At this point, I just like to clip all of my loose threads. There are plenty of them. I like to give my cami a final press, and then it is ready to wear. It's also not a bad idea to go ahead and put some kind of tag or marking on the back of your cami. It looks very similar on the front and the back, and it can get a little confusing when you're trying to put it on later down the road. Thank you so much for joining me for the Ogden Sewalong. I hope it was helpful, and I hope that you love your finished Ogden cami.